Actually, I mean, that's a really interesting segue into, I guess, buying, which I spent, like, most of my professional life doing. Because it really should be. And that shift that you talked about has really happened to our entire world. And I'm sure that you've had many conversations about that. But like buying should really be like at least 50% gut and 50% like analytics. And I think as our world has changed and quite rapidly so, especially after COVID, that focus, but I can feel that in the entire industry, like when I started, there was a lot of creativity, and a lot of like imagination. And that means magic. And that I think in a way is also like a little bit what customers are feeling and why some of that fatigue is happening because a lot of that magic is lost today because it's become so transactional. And I think it's because the business is like the bigger they grow, the more scared they get about, just trusting guts and creativity, right? But actually, without that sort of, no guts, no glory, you just sort of you stop and everything becomes very formulatic. And then that's where like, you get into the thing of like not trusting the machines, but like you trust the figures and the numbers to a point that you're scared of like just kind of throwing them away. Because we always used to say it's like rule number one is like when you walk into the room, you leave yourself and you become the customer when you walk into the room because you're not buying for yourself. But I think at the same time, I mean, there's always obviously like a slight subconsciousness when you are buying, particularly if you're like connected with the product you see in front of you. But as much as possible, obviously, you should really be the customer rather than you're not buying for you unless you really fully are embraced as one of the customers. But even then, there has to be a level of like just distancing to kind of really sort of see it. But I think where you sort of where you lose it is if you don't like you should always know your numbers, right? And especially if you're in bigger fund. But like if you're not prepared to like tear up like all those pieces of paper and all the figures that you see and they're telling you to like either go for it or not go for it because the thing that you're seeing in front of you like is either the best thing that ever happened or like you're like back to the drawing board really, or like something is missing. I think that's what scares me today actually about the world that I came from and I grew up in fashion.
Tell me about that intuition. Is that something that you can teach people, or is that something that is innate in somebody?
It's something that yeah, it's innate. I mean, that's I mean, there's a level that you can train, and I think very much like what we talked about now. There's someone who maybe is more into the spiritual world will naturally become a better healer because they have it inside them. But you can train it to a certain degree because part of it is also like noticing patterns and being aware about what's happening and I guess like in a way like reading the room but almost like reading it in advance. So like if you're really really good at like seeing patterns or very connected to communities and happening, and this is like ideally like far beyond fashion. Fashion has always had a lot of siblings in the world of like music and art, but also beyond that, like now in technology, for example. And if you can be really aware of all those things, then you can learn to spot patterns that can then sort of almost advise how you take your business and where you grow. And I think a lot of time something is like it's still the feeling, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm sure it's like what you said, or when you really like you either you feel that like something is so right or you're just not sure about it. And I think almost training that feeling, I mean, I think we all to a certain degree have it and just people are just more aware of it and some people just choose to completely like push it down. But I think yeah, I think it definitely can be trained, but you just have to be open to being trained. And I think that's where sometimes people are at varying degrees of openness.
In a lot of ways, it's kind of like a muscle. So it's something that's there, but unless you're working it, you're not going to get any better at it.
Exactly. And I think a lot of ways seen as well. I mean, I was really lucky in my career that I had people that I saw that, I had a certain like level of sort of like openness there, but they also encouraged me to like really, grow that muscle, so to say. But I've also seen, people, and that's actually like sometimes when I, later in my career, when I, started managing people too, and especially like kind of larger teams and stuff, or you'd have someone come from another company and you saw like a spark in them in the interview, but you had to almost like retrain like that thing because they'd been so conditioned to buy by like numbers, for example. And I think there's this, it really kind of can be like, I guess it's like in a way, the way that the world works in, the whole nurture versus nature, right? That you can almost like apply that to any profession and definitely to the buying world.
How much of that training or just that intuition, separate from if we're talking about a buyer who has the intuition, I'm sure that timing is also a big piece of it because we'll use what's happening right now as an example, but we're in a hard economy, and a lot of people are playing it safe. There's crisis around the world everywhere. So if you had, a buyer who's 20 years old and they're just now coming into a company, I mean, how much does that timing matter too? Because I think if the world and fashion is flourishing and you spend a good 5 years of being able to listen to your intuition, I'm sure that would make a big difference, right? Or what do you think?
Well, I think that part of the issue today is maybe that, you know, I think there's different ways to play safe, right? I think I mean, it's undisputable that the world is on fire and it's just not, I mean, not just in fashion, like everything that's happening, politically, war, etc. is obviously all, I mean, Brexit here in the UK, all things that are really kind of, pushing the industry and all sort of, but I think the problem for me becomes when you then think that you have to play it safe. Yes, you maybe have to like pull back. You need to like, in some cases, which, is heartbreaking to watch. There's been like, rounds and rounds of like restructures and things happening in the UK, in pretty much every company. Um, but sometimes, understandably, there is like, a bottom line that has to be fulfilled. But, that's also like, I think in times of uncertainty, like actually delivering magic is even more important. So I think if you take away and everything just becomes like cold, hard facts, you're kind of almost like fueling the trouble and the problems because the customer is not going to be engaged by that. And I think today, I went to a really, really interesting breakfast this morning, and we talked a lot about the whole kind of, like community and, how do you speak on a global level. But I think one thing that's happened with everything becoming, global, which is great in many senses because you can have a real identify, like a real community that becomes clear. But I think sometimes it can also translate as slightly boring. Like when I started my career, we used to, spend like half a day or a day, like in all the different places that we traveled to just walk around and, be inspired by the local stores and, even like department stores and so on, and you were inspired because you'd find things and you'd look at people, how they're dressed. And today, that's not the case. And I think the customer, because the borders are, not really there anymore. And that's fantastic. You can sit in a basement in the middle of nowhere and still deliver an amazing collection, right? Or, an amazing product. And that's an advantage. But I think sometimes the disadvantage is that it's the same product that sells everywhere. It's the same things that people want. But that also, in some cases, just means that the whole experience becomes slightly flat, right? There's nothing there that kind of like pushes your imagination or make you stop. And I think that's why it's so interesting today that there's so much talk about, the physical experience and how do you gauge customer outside of product and how do you inspire customer loyalty and how do you, build a fan base.
And when companies come to you asking those questions, how do you discern what the answer is for those brands or companies?
I think the most important starting point, because I think this is where sometimes it goes a little bit wrong as well, is that when it is like there's no, I mean, very much to our conversation about, our own bodies and how everyone is different, is that there's no one formula. You really have to break down the specific company or person who's sitting in front of you to understand what it is that they stand for and the values of that company or organization, and then take that as a base to build out what is going to be right for them, whether they're coming to look for, an enhancement of product, or, community building, or, expansion or understanding of different regions. Because I think, you know, to have that kind of like, I have this like perfect map of how everything works, it doesn't work for everyone. And I think that sometimes you can see that with this sort of like, maybe like copycat marketing, where someone has done something that is fantastic and really like engages an audience, and then everyone like is like, yes, this is the way to do it, and then all of a sudden everyone is doing it, and then that in a way kills the experience a little bit, but also doesn't necessarily translate to something that feels authentic for your proposition or your brand or your organization.
Is there usually a problem that across the board is something that's happening when somebody is seeking your guidance on something? Is there kind of like three things that you can almost always like place it in that bucket?
I think that in an exciting way, the short answer is no, because some brands or retail partners, they come because they actually like everything is going really well, but they're just like, how do I get to the next stage? Which is a different proposition, or they want to like look to expand into different categories, and they just kind of need that support on how they do that, or they're looking for how do I grow to a level where I can get external investment to get myself to where I need to be, or do I need that? But other ones, obviously, yes, there is something where they need help with. I think that the kind of the one word that people keep coming back to, like at the moment, I think this year, which obviously is not just to us, but I think you read about it in every you know internal, external, like even kind of floating into outside of the fashion world, and it's like, how do we build a community? And I think that also needs to be dissected, because I think sometimes what they're looking for is like they look at some brands which are maybe not actually applicable to their audience. But I think what's interesting lately is that a lot of people are looking at like, or at least coming to us, is not so much about like, how do I grow? I mean, that's also maybe not so much our expertise, and there are some fantastic people that we can direct them to if they're looking to sort of grow their social media presence and so on. We can recommend and do help them that strategy, but in terms of the execution, it's not quite what we do in our company. But at the same time, I think where they're interested is like, how do I actually engage the customer that I already have, and how can I, through their network, or his, her, them, like how can I, find the friends of friends, and how can I engage them outside of a thing that doesn't necessarily have to be like an amazing, has to go on like, Instagram or TikTok or all over like all our channels, and it doesn't have to, be in the store or be a pop-up or something like that. Like how can we sort of really genuinely connect and get them to be part of our journey, but not just for this moment, but also like, engage them like long term. And how can we, talk to customer that maybe wants another level of loyalty as well, and maybe are not always like, because I think the customer is like, you can follow, right? And you kind of, there's like a level of like the brands that you admire, but maybe you don't wear, versus the ones that you actually wear.
Yeah, and at every stage of the fashion business currently, unless you have a newsletter or something, but even then there's a step of distance, but retail is not really set up like that, because you don't know who's coming and finding your pieces interesting, or usually you don't even know who the client is specifically. And then, as you said, social media is like the shotgun approach, which you might have a lot of people that are watching you, but they may not be paying attention.
Yeah, I think that's I think sometimes, and it's interesting, right? And people are now, you have companies like Launch Metrics, for example, that like really measure like what is that like engagement rate, and how do you like fully understand? Because you look at a lot of like big luxury brands that are struggling, and if you look at their accounts and the numbers of followers, those figures look really impressive, but it doesn't necessarily translate to like a physical sale, or multiple of sales. So maybe it's just one, every 5 years, or even someone who's just kind of an aspiring to. So is that kind of multi-layer, I guess, strategy as well, to not just be seen and look like, oh, look, I have millions of followers, but actually, um, how do I engage those people that maybe don't even actually are on Instagram, right? Or TikTok or whatever other outlet that you use. So there's definitely a lot more to consider these days. I think this is particularly, and my heart goes out to them a lot in this case, because they're always very close to my heart. But it's like the young designers today, because they have to have so many hats these days. More than, it's not just about someone doing a beautiful product or a great collection. You have people that do that and they don't succeed because there's so much noise that they just kind of like drown out. And I mean, I guess in fashion, it's always been like that. There's always been a little bit like by invitation only. It's just that the game has changed, but it's still, those barriers are still there. They just look slightly different than they did in the past.
And when you started, social media was not a thing. So do you remember the moment where you were in the tenure of the work that you were doing as a buyer and you said, this is going to change everything?
No, because I think it happened gradually. I think in the sense that like, little by little, it was like, and today I think it's harder to do it, but like in, sort of like halfway through, and we're talking maybe like 10 years or a little bit more so ago, like where you could just actually, it was a great way to find things. I think for me, it was like when that sort of excitement stopped of finding things when I went on my like official travel, so like, the official fashion cities. And then we were doing all these off schedule cities that were like something that I was really passionate about, because that's where we could find newness. But then you realize also there's only like, you can have like 180 days, you can have 360 days a year, but you're still not going to like cover everything. And that's when we started using social media as that vehicle to find things that weren't everywhere. And then sort of started to really kind of push the team members that weren't on it to also start to use that as a vehicle. And I think it was extremely useful. And I think, I mean, like during the pandemic, it was like, 'cause I was still really, for me, it was like adamant to be able to continue to support new talent and to continue to actually give the customer something that wasn't just expected. And then it became vital, right? Because that was the only way that you could, travel the world. But I think it wasn't like a eureka moment for me. I think it actually just kind of like almost like came upon you. But I do remember like having conversation with journalists, and it was like, where do you find, the brands? And it was like, well, actually, like maybe we went to see them first, but it would almost be like you do your research and then you're like, okay, great. Like even to the point of like, I'm going to go on holiday to this place and I'm going to just like stop by, and because there's this, you know, little old man who's making like fisherman sandals, and but I saw him on Instagram, so I'm going to go and like look him up. But I still love those moments because those are like the moments of something different.
Yeah. And so, how I'm hearing what you're saying is it was a slow change, but really it was a tool for discovery. But then that tool turned into a metric in and of itself to base the brand value on.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I still sort of very firm. It's like that it doesn't necessarily have to be that like when you find something, if they don't have, like you can find something and you find that they have actually like thousands of followers, or you can find something and they have like two followers. Like for me, it's always about like the what is there rather than like the metrics around them. I mean, sometimes it's harder to find the ones with two than the ones with like thousands, of course, because of algorithms again. And I think, I mean, actually, like recently, I think the algorithm is really, in an annoying way, working against that discovery. Whereas, like, in the past, it was like really like kind of almost like a free for all search and losing yourself in it. I think for me it was like because it all kind of happened simultaneously as like the first time I went on a actually when I started in buying we would the buyers, I was the admin, and the buyers would come back from market, and you would all stand in a line by the fax machine, like just wait for like the beep, 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 beep,
What's
beep.
a fax machine, Ida? No, I was
Yeah,
kidding.
exactly. Exactly. This is the sad reality where I go to like some weird old like electronic stores and you might find a relic somewhere. And we had to like stand and staple everything together. And then obviously like then it was like the BlackBerry wave and I was like surgically attached to the point of like getting like repetitive strain injury from like, click, 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 clicking on the BlackBerry. And then, then there was like all the world of Apple coming through. But also like things of like like obviously like internet was there because I'm not that old. I'm old, but like I'm not ancient. But it was a time where you like it was great because you'd go to market and you'd put your out of office on, and you're like, I'm back in 2 weeks' time, so I'll pick up whatever is going on when I'm
Yeah.
back. And people were like okay with that, so it allowed you. And I think it does. I do. I mean, obviously that was wonderful in many ways, but it also allowed you to network and really like build partnerships and find build friendships as well. And I think that's one of the things that I moved to England from Sweden, and like my entire world in England is like in a weird way like it's like I live in a fashion bubble because I came to do a fashion degree, and my husband also works in fashion, so like by sort of result I don't really know people so much that don't do fashion or some sort of creative, like, which is actually why I sometimes have to like with my friends back home in Sweden, I'm like I have to do check-ins with them as well because they're like sometimes I think you can get pulled into the bubble too much, and you things that we really care about in fashion really don't, like even people that like fashion. I think the most hilarious example is like like a private client that we had in Browns who, like when we were super upset about Hedi Slimane leaving Saint Laurent, I'm like the biggest Hedi fan, but I love him as a designer. And he, and we were like, oh, what about, what are you gonna do? It was like a big, like biggest Saint Laurent client. And they were like, who's Hedi Slimane? And you're like, oh yeah, okay. And they're like, is it gonna change? And you're like, no, I don't think so, because Anthony's, he's also a really good designer, and they're like, okay, so why are you upset? And I was like, yeah, 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 that makes sense. I think that sometimes we put so much into things, and they become like life and death, right? Because it's our livelihood, and it's yeah, and that's why I love doing like the reality checks with what I sort of see as like my friends back home. They're like love fashion, but they're not in fashion. It's really good to like sometimes like bounce against them if I'm being crazy, or if it's actually legit that I'm worried or excited about something.
Yeah, I think we can all be that way, and I think it's really passion when it comes down to it. So we might get upset or really drawn into like a particular drama or something. What's going to happen with Chanel or whatever? And most of the world doesn't
Yeah, yeah,
really care.
exactly.
But I think that's part of just being
Yeah,
passionate about our world.
it's true. It's true. I think it is interesting because obviously, I mean, we always joke about this. Obviously, like the fashion people in themselves, they don't really ever buy full price product generally because they always have a way to get a discount, right? So the people that sit in like, if you draw like circles, like then there's like the circle outside of that is actually the one, if you're a retailer at least, like that's the one that you're really interested in. The ones that are like engaged with fashion, but they don't live and breathe it.
Right. Tell me about your training. So you went to fashion school in England, moved from Sweden. And how did you how did you get into your first buying job?
Yeah, it was so I actually did I mean I think the whole in a way was a bit random because actually the reason why I found a fashion school is because I ran into me and my friend were backpacking. We ran into a girl on a beach in Bali because I didn't know that there was such a thing as like buying. I mean, I think if I thought about it, then I did. But I grew up in this university town in Sweden, so I was like, I want to work with human rights. I want to work with an NGO. Um, I always loved fashion, and then this woman was like sitting in a bikini with all these sketches, and we were like, what are you doing? And she was like, oh, I'm a buyer. And I was like, this is what I want to do. So we sort of like interrogated this poor woman, and she told me about LCF, which is where I ended up going, that they had this program called like buying, like fashion management, which concentrated on like buying and merchandising, or rather, as is called in America, like planning and merchandising, because it's very confusing that in most cases, merchandising in America is actually buying and planning is merchandising. But I don't know what is right or wrong in that sense, but essentially that's what that course was. And through that course, I got an internship at Harvey Nichols. And that's actually how I sort of got my first. So I worked there my last year of my degree, and that led me to get like a full-time job at the end of it. And then I ended up being at Harvey Nichols for 10 years, and then I moved from there to Net-a-Porter, and then from there to Browns.
Is there somebody early in your career? Because when, I guess why I'm thinking about this is all of the things that you talk about, intuition, listening to your gut, those generally feel like the antithesis of what a big box store like a Harvey Nichols, Net-a-Porter, Browns. I guess maybe Mrs. B was very much supportive of young designers, but did you have somebody at the beginning that you really attribute kind of like your real experience and how you ended up treating the business over the course of your career?
Yeah, I had a few people. I mean, the first person was this. I mean, she still works in buying. She's still at Harvey Nichols actually. She's the head of non-apparel there. She's an amazing woman called Tina Lamb, who is like what she doesn't know about bags and accessories is like not worth knowing. She's like a walking, talking dictionary. But more than anything, like what she really like inspired for me, not just that kind of trusting your gut, was also like watching her in action versus like some of the other buyers perhaps. She was herself, and she was more than anything just like a really wonderful, like kind, and really gave of herself, and she didn't have any airs or graces or anything. And for me that was so inspiring because up until that point that I started working for her, which I did as a she gave me the opportunity to be when I became a junior buyer. But I kind of sort of knew her a little bit and had watched her, and I was like in awe of her within the organization because she just kind of exuded this like just warmth and welcoming. But what I saw with her, which was really fascinating, was that like how much more she got out of the same brands than maybe other buyers also worked with in other categories. But because she gave of herself and she was always like willing to listen to them, and she was just, I guess, like normal in a sense. And for me, it was like a real eye opener because I think up in that moment, I remember having conversations with my friends back home, and they were like, "Oh, do you want to be a buying director?" And I was like, "Oh, I can never be a buying director because, you have to be mean." And because that was not saying that all the buying directors at that time were, but I think there was a perception of like that you had to behave a certain way and be quite cold and distant, and the Tina sort of just threw all of that out, and it was really inspiring to see that. And then one of my friends, she was on the supplier side, and we had a conversation. Her name is Hillevi. She's a Swedish girl as well. Actually, she was working at Dan from Furstenberg that time. She was like, yeah, but of course, just like in the end, it's like there are things that you have to give to certain buyers based on where they work, but there's also times when because you just like that person that you will do whatever, like you will go that extra mile for that person because there is like a give and take in that relationship. And that for me, that was really motivating. And I was lucky enough that there was a merchandiser at Harvey Nichols as well that kind of indulged my gut feeling. And his name's Darren. He's still a very good friend of mine. And he would like allow me to rob the pot of money if I found something I really believed in and go like above and beyond what my technical allocated OTB was. And that sort of taught me that like I guess like the ways that you can buy a product and really go deep with like volume behind it versus just being like, oh, I'm going to hedge my bets across everything. So that was really interesting. And then I was lucky enough actually, because I think maybe today Net-a-Porter is perceived as one of these like big, beasts of the industry, and, a wonderful beast in many ways, but still like, a big corporate organization. But I was lucky enough to be there when Natalie was there, and also Natalie Massenet, who is, one of the most inspiring people in this industry has ever seen, because she's like a true visionary in so many ways. And underneath her, she had Holly Rogers, who still remains a very close friend of mine today. She was actually the CEO. She was the one who kidnapped me to Browns from Net-a-Porter. And the two of them together were just this, amazing force of nature. And when I joined, Net-a-Porter was still already quite big. They had like the fancy spaceship office in West London, but it's still, because of the two of them, it felt like anything was possible, and it felt like you could make changes, and that it wasn't like kind of this like sort of step and layers or anything, because they kind of brought the dream to life, and also really like Holly was and has been probably like the most influential person on my career, not just because she kind of continued to be my boss, but there was also like even in the time when she left Net-a-Porter, I think like a year and a half before she sort of, well, actually maybe like 2 years actually before she joined Browns and then kidnapped me over there. And during that time, we still kind of kept in contact, and I just found her like it was so inspiring to be able to have her as my mentor, and to be able to have those kind of like conversations about you know just things that I was facing, or challenges, or even like opportunities.
And was the main thing that drew you to those women, was there a trust there that you felt like gave you confidence? Or what was it exactly that kind of bound you to them specifically?
I think it was like different things. So like with Tina, it was just her personality and the fact that she was just like, she. But I guess actually, all of them had like a anything is possible like mindset. And I think for me, whether that's like however you like man, woman, or however you identify, like to me that is something that is really inspiring for me too. But obviously, as a woman as well in this industry, there is still a glass ceiling. So I guess like Holly and Natalie in particular, obviously having started Netaport and still leading it when I was there, was incredibly inspiring to see, because it was so rare to have a woman in that position. And I think with Natalie, it not only did she have this like amazing mind, and she just dreamt up new worlds constantly, sometimes on a daily basis, but she also she was not afraid to be vulnerable. Like she could easily, like when like the 10-year anniversary of it started, and she was like presenting people that had been there from things, she was not afraid of like crying on stage in front of like the entire company. And I think there's always that perception sometimes with women, is like, you can't show your emotions, you have to be this like robot and stuff. So I think that was also really nice to see, that you can be passionate, but it can still be inspiring.
Yeah. And that hope thing is so important. I'm always thinking about how when I would be feeling low or feeling like maybe I can't do this, there would always be something that happens that just reminds you that it's possible. And so if you have a mentor that can show you the pathway, it is really like a superpower.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's so, and I think also just sometimes it's also like just that general, to your point, it's like that mindset of just seeing things as like the glass is half full rather than half empty, right? Like even at times of hardship or trouble, that like there is always like some sort of tiny bit of light that you can find in that, and not take comfort or find inspiration from, or find a way around how to do things, back to what we talked about earlier with like this, people playing it safe. Like safe doesn't have to be prescriptive always.
Do you remember the moment when you first listened to your intuition and maybe had to fight one of your bosses and stick up for your decision and it ended up working out? Do you remember that first time?
Trying to think, now I'm like feeling really spoiled that I always managed to somehow convince people that I could spend the money that I wanted to spend. I think the worst thing, like that happened very early on, was when I just became like when I was a junior buyer, and I bought this is like the I don't know because obviously well, do you know what the Chloe Susanna boot is?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a season that came out. I think it was like autumn winter 2007 or something. And I was like, oh my God, this boot is amazing. So, and I was like, and they gave me a price in the showroom. I was like, this is unbelievable. It's so affordable. This is great. So I was like, literally, like, I spent, like, I bought so many units. And I was like, this is going to be the boot of the season. This is great. And then, unbeknownst to me, we had like an intern who checked the order confirmation. And that price was so wrong. It was like half the price of what it actually was. But I didn't know, so everything got checked. We put the order together. Chloe was like, I was like, oh, it's so nice how much they love me. Because unbeknownst to me, like until they rolled up the season, and I got called into like the head of merchandise, and they were like, you're like X amount of millions over like your budget, and I was like, what? I was like, no, no. I kept such a because I always had this like because at Harvey Nichols it was very like it was like you rob Peter to pay Paul, which is like an English expression where I was like, I'm going to take
Right.
5K from here and I'm going to put 10K here. And it was like a puzzle. So I'd always have this like spreadsheet on my computer and just be like, I love this shoe. Okay, but like I don't have the money. So like everything had to balance out. And I was like, it's impossible. And I started like looking into it and I was like, oh my God. It was like
Did your soul
this,
leave your body?
I was so scared. And the boot came in, and I was like, oh my God. And, I was like called into the buying director, and it was like, this is like not great. And then luckily for me, this bloody boot became like despite the elevated price or double the price of what I thought it was, it basically like sold out and became like this super hot things. And then all of a sudden it was like, yeah, everyone forgave me. Um,
Of course they did.
yeah,
Yeah.
as they always do in those cases. But it was, yeah, that was like a real, I guess like what that taught me in that sense was like just to, double, triple check that you can't just always rely, not that I was like nitpicking on things, but just to kind of like run like, where exactly am I and not just like wait until the final curtain kind of falls and it's too late to, because obviously I tried to cancel some of these books and they were like, they've been produced. And you're like, what am I gonna do? But of course, there was other times when when it didn't. I mean, I remember like we were like when Marc Jacobs was at Perry Ellis, and we thought that was gonna be. I mean, and that collection was so amazing. I wonder, actually how much like if you go to like maybe people don't know, but like it was like was at the beginning of that whole grunge thing. But it was just the wrong brand, and like we had it on the wrong floor. Like it was like put on the second floor of Harvey Nichols, which was like the kind of at that point the sort of more like conservative, slightly older lady floor, with like Armani Collezione and S. Max Mara and like Weekday and stuff like that. So it obviously looked completely out of phase and absolutely failed miserably. I mean, I guess that was the same thing for everywhere, obviously, because Marc Jacobs then got, unceremoniously fired and then went on to do his own brand that was like then on fire like crazy. So I think to your point that you made earlier, it's like uh, sometimes there is a timing situation as well. Sometimes it's something is too early. And we talked about this a lot actually with this whole new revival of like the boho trend that's now coming back. And Shemina at Chloe, and it was such a beautiful collection that she delivered. But when we thought about it, it was like, wait, if she had done that, but like even maybe like 6 months earlier, would we have felt the same way? I don't know, because we needed to reach this like saturation point of like quiet luxury where you would just which is how you then like you have the boho and then you have this like sporty preppy that Miu Miu has been like championing. So sometimes timing is everything. You can have the best product, but it's just not right when with the quiet luxury trend. Actually, to be honest, like I was almost like by the end of the season and they hadn't even delivered yet, already not bored with it, but scared of it because it was, if you've been there before, and actually back to the conversation that we had around the trends, and how people are playing it safe. Like last time I saw everything go very tonal and black and beige and brown and etc. It was like the worst selling season ever, and it was after the Lehman Brothers crash. So I was kind of scared of what it was going to look like, and obviously it was not the easiest season because the reality is that there's like five brands that do quite luxury well, and if it's a trend, then people are going to go to those brands. They're not necessarily going to buy the version of the version of the version. But I think it still continued for a while because people were so adamant, and brands were really like bought into it. So it was like that relief when Chloe came out with this, the new version of boho. And obviously Miu Miu had already started like two seasons earlier with that kind of preppy sporty, which was like a much more interesting take, I think. Not just for me, because obviously you look at the Miu Miu's reported figures, and they're like one of the few brands in the world that like triple digit, double digit growth, but just like this like preppy chic version, which is this, yeah, I guess a version of that luxury because it's like kind of riffing on the Sebago and boating and golfing and all of those worlds, but like with this like very wonderful Miu Miu tongue in cheek way of interpreting those worlds.
How would you analyze trends that you saw happening? Did you have your own internal markers that you were looking for?
Well, yes and no. I mean, sometimes it would be that you would see something happening in the sort of like top tier, and generally you could almost always rely on like Mucha to kind of almost like tell you what the trend was going to be, both for men's and women's. And then you knew that like next season everyone would be like, okay, wait, let's scramble, let's follow like Mrs. Prada. So there would be like little kind of, sometimes it would be like little, almost like trickles that you could feel that some like change was coming. Sometimes it would be like very like, this is it. It's like you walk in and it's like, the quiet luxury, for example, it's like everyone went to the same conference somewhere and read up on it and decided they were going to go for it. But I really liked analyzing those things when you could see the little bits that were sort of floating in, and then all of a sudden they would like build out to something bigger. Or sometimes they would be coming from like street level and then be translated into like the big brands, but sometimes like vice versa. Like any kind of denim trends and things that would come from the big houses, we always had fun with trying to then find a way to give like a version of that from some of the denim brands when they were maybe like when the whole like Balenciaga super baggy jeans were coming, where like someone doesn't have like a pair of like 900 pounds spare, then what are the options, because clearly this is going to be something really big. So it was also like, but kind of sometimes it was like, but how do we offer something to maybe that sort of aspirational, or like not even sometimes aspirational, because I think there is validity in like how many people actually want to spend 900 pounds for a pair of jeans, right? So I think sometimes also be able to offer that choice to people, like if you're not going to buy, you want a trend, like, but you don't necessarily want to invest in Balenciaga. You have both, and that's the exciting part, right?
Yeah, but that's interesting because it is like, in a way, hedging your bet a little bit. Because if you pick up this brand that has a $200 price point, that even is giving you more information on where everything is. And I'm sure, using the Balenciaga example, I'm sure sometimes you felt like the opposite was happening, where people are buying Sperry's boat shoes. So like, we now should buy the Prada version of that. Do you feel like it ever happened the other way around, where it was actually the low cost piece showed you maybe what to buy on the high end?
Yeah, but mainly from the more kind of like sneaker led, or like more streetwear genre, where something would come through and then that would become the big thing, more than maybe just like something. I mean, like I really wanted at one point like Sparrows to happen, back in Net-a-Porter, because I can't remember actually who it was that did something, and I was like, this is going to be great, let's go and get Sparrows, but it did not happen. Definitely too early. The same when I tried to do a women's sneaker wall in like 2006 or something. It was just too early. Sometimes you're
The
too early with
timing. We're
your,
back to the
yeah,
timing. Yeah.
exactly that. Um, but yeah, no, I think what is interesting in that is like all this, like the Palaces and Supremes and Nikes and Adis of the world that have inspired and made so many changes to the luxury world, to be honest. And like it just even like not just outside of product, but looking at the drop model and how they launch things and the community building and everything else. And then obviously like the whole kind of Gorp core trend that then happened, like the very or even like how like at the moment, and that still obviously is happening, like how sports have had this like real center, and I talked about that with Miu Miu in a way, but like even to like there was like cycling, and then it's running, and then it's tennis. Um, it's really interesting, how people are then kind of like taking some of those references, but also obviously you also see. I mean, if you look at like a brand like Arc'teryx, for example, it's like one of the absolute best climbing, like outdoor proper brands in the world. And I love how their strategy is in terms of who they work with in the luxury fashion world, and how sort of annoyingly controlled it is as well. And because you just get like super tight budgets, but it's very clever because the reality is if you go to like World of Outdoor Sports up in like, I don't know, like the Lake District, I mean, you can find all of those jackets in abundance for the people that actually use them for the right reason, right? But trying to find, I mean, like we would always sell out in about a nanosecond when we got our uploads on our Terex. And then sometimes it was kind of funny because that customer would get like whatever, like, oh my God, it's sold out. And we're like, don't really want to tell you this, but you could just like, head to that outdoors. But I think this also shows maybe sometimes that disconnect between like a fashion, someone who would never go hiking or, go out in the wilderness. But like they really wanted that jacket that everyone like as you walked past, there was like that little nod from the other men. Like it's, I mean, my husband he actually does also like love the outdoors. I mean, he's like the guy who nothing makes him as happy as like building your own toilet in the wilderness kind of situation. But like it's just funny like when you see people. But he also is like the ultimate like acronym, you know, Gorp core man.
Like he wants to carry his shovel with him everywhere in the city or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But also like, like then assumes that like, fashion persona, like acronym is like, I mean, the amazing with acronyms, I have so much love for that brand. It's obviously like fully functional, but it's also like got that amazing avant-garde, like just the details, which you can really nerd out of. And I think that was like, the excitement with, and which is, it's still there. Like, it's not that it's kind of gone away. It's obviously not as strongly a trend as it was before, but I think those people that are geeking out over like little details, they will always kind of continue to geek out over details.
It goes back to that thing you were saying about finding your audience originally. I think the best companies that are operating right now have been able to find their audience, even if it's split between two different audiences. And another great example, Arc'teryx, of course, is a great example, but Carhartt is a perfect example as well. But it took somebody outside of the organization the insight to say, you know what, like let's do this work in progress thing, and let's just shift it 5% this way in order to give it a whole different meaning. But really that's those are two different audiences in a way, but they've been able to marry it together to build something truly remarkable.
Carhartt, I think the Carhartt for me is also like there was like this brand I was obsessed with when I was a little wannabe skater girl growing up in the 90s. So like I mean they just still don't really do. They had this like amazing like scuba material that I remember we were like in New York, and we went to like Brooklyn to buy like Carhartt, and it was like obviously, which it still is in America, which is interesting. Like my husband was always like, buying it from like the workwear sites, and it's about, about $10 or whatever. But of course, I was that sucker that when Sakai did a version of that hoodie and it's like £500, I'm like, I'm gonna get it. And then I got the grey one, and I was like, I love this one. I'm gonna get the black one as well. And then in my mind, I was like, still thinking I was saving money because the Miu Miu one that I also love was like £2,000. So I was like, well, I got two, and it was only half price. Whereas obviously, like the reality is, and I do know this, is that like I could have just gone out and got the actual Carhartt version. But I think for me it was this like, I mean, Sakai is a brand. It's like, I will live and die for Sakai. So the fact that like my childhood love of Carhartt was like married with Sakai was just like this match made in heaven for me.
Well, and I think that's where the collaborations work best, because something that's made for somebody who's in construction, like what Carhartt pants would be, they're not thinking of it with the fashion nuances. And so I understand why if Chitose Abe puts her twist on it, she's coming into a situation where she can put her design language into something. That's when collaborations really are at their best.
Yeah, I agree. I think that like, unfortunately, although there's like, a collaboration a minute these days, I think that that real like tug of the heart and excitement is like getting more and more rare these days. Maybe because there is also such an abundance of product, um, which is just kind of frightening in itself, to be honest.
I think people caught on and they realized if we just put the logos together, we can sell it. And it worked for a little while. So I think what you're really seeing is a change in how people look at the collaborations. I still think it's really important, but if you're just trying to change the colorway of something, and calling it a collaboration, I think that's where the trouble is.
I think, I mean, there's still, and I hope, we haven't seen all of them yet, because, when you start to think about it, you can dream up amazing things in your mind. And it can be the most inspiring thing, but I think where there is in either like a complementary or like a completely opposite attracts, but it is still is like very authentic. Because I think sometimes today it feels like a lot of collaborations are happening for the sake of having a collaboration. Whereas like when there is like a genuine love between two companies or a designer and a product or something, I feel like you can feel that in how it's been, designed, if that makes sense. Um, and I think that's where like, because there were so many successes with these things of like, to your point, like, putting the logos together or whatever, version of it there was. I think sometimes, as I talked about as well, it's, where someone is just like, here's a formula, and now everyone has to do it. But it's a bit like when Vetmon came and Demna, all of a sudden, all these like very like pulled together, super like, high heel, like tight little dresses, women were all of a sudden like, putting hoodies on. At first, I was like super excited because it was like a kind of almost like, for me, it was like, thank God, the way that I dress on my holidays or my weekend is now like a legit way of dressing at work. Because I'd always had this like, very like two sides of my personality. Because I was like, as I said, I was like, grew up as this like kind of in the skate culture, and I loved, that way of dressing, but it's not really appropriate for luxury fashion for a long time. So I would have my sort of like holiday weekend self, and then, the sort of prim and proper like Ida that would like put the heels on. And that's, yeah, hence how that, sneaker wall came to life for Petition a little bit early. But all of a sudden it was like, okay, and these like really pulled together women with their blow dried hair and whatever would still have like their little Vetmon hoodie. But then it kind of went so far where again, like everyone was trying to do it. And that, like when you came into brands that were like so far away from that aesthetic, and they were like, oh, here is our sweatshirt section, or here is like our hoodies, and you're like, this doesn't make sense. You should still do what you're good at. And I think that's where sometimes when a trend gets so all immersive, is that the danger when brands get confused and think that, oh, I need to jump onto this trend. So whether that is like, everyone doing a hoodie because Demna is doing a hoodie, or whether it's, you're, trying to like, you could see like the successes of these amazing collaborations that were happening. And then now everyone is like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And then all of a sudden it becomes a formula that doesn't always work.
Do you think part of the problem with the big brands when it comes to what you're talking about, is it the change of creative directors? Because I think sometimes the brands that change creative directors almost too closely, because to give a designer 2 years really is not enough time, because so much can change. But using Balenciaga as an example, Nicolas Gesquiere was so different from Alexander Wang, which is so different from Demna. Now, Demna's been able to transform the brand, but not every luxury brand has that same response. Do you think that can be part of the problem, is that a customer doesn't know exactly if that brand is going to be doing that next season?
Yeah, and I mean, I think sometimes that's also that like the alienation of like who the customer was when something goes too far and they're not. I mean, like, to take Burberry for example, where it gets sort of it, it, when something gets completely changed, but very quickly, and it's like kind of from one day to the other. It you know there usually is like a customer that's still there, and he's you have to be. I mean, and it's a big gamble, right? And some people are like prepared to take that gamble, but it can really like that's like a full no guts, no glory situation. And I think you're absolutely right. It scares me today how quickly like CDs are getting, like coming in and out. And how, I mean, the pressure that is, I mean, I know they're getting paid like, very high salaries, but the pressure and, how they are just kind of pulled apart if they don't deliver, it's quite terrifying to me. I mean, I think like Sean at McQueen, for example, and I want to, yeah, I think like Olya and Van Granary like made such an interesting point there. And they're like, why are we all just pointing the finger as the creative director? Like actually, the board that hired them, it's like there's a lot of people involved in these decisions. You can't put something that maybe don't quite fall where you need it to fall or where you want it to fall on one person's feet, and I think that's we're very quick to point fingers and like tear things down. I think it's unfortunately on the backside of people having a half full situation that people like to pull people down, and I think it's not a very nice human quality.
Yeah, and it's part of just how our industry works now. It almost starts to cannibalize itself, because Sean at McQueen, whether you like his work or not, he's only been there for a couple seasons. So if you're already wanting to toss him out, I mean, the pressure is on to toss them out. I mean, we're just moving so quick. It's part of why when you talk about brands that are relying on the same kind of things as each other to sell, and everything starts to look the same, part of that is because of this pressure, because everybody's like, well, now you need a dad shoe. Well, now you need a this, like, Virgil crushed it with hoodies. So like everybody has to have a graphic hoodie. Like, and, with a brand like mine, I do my best to stay outside of what the trend is, but the
That's the
response to
right way
that,
to do it.
I think so too, which is why I do it. But you do pay for it. You pay for it in the energy that's behind your thing, or the people that are excited about it, or the people that are buying it. So it's hard as a designer. You're trying to keep these two things in balance. Is like something that is something that gauges a response from people, but not falling into kind of this like meme brand, because you
Yeah,
really are
I
you're trading long-term and short-term goals when you're doing that.
it's true, but I mean, I love you for saying that because I mean, also like that Sean is he's a really talented designer, and he had about 2 seconds to pull that together, and I think today more than ever, I think it is the most important thing is to be true to what your point of view and your authentic self version of your brand or your DNA of your brand. Because to just jump and try to, be something else for someone else because the trends are going in a direction. Like today, particularly with, uh, what like, if you look at TikTok, there's about like 5 trends a day, right? So if you're doing that, you're just becoming everything for everyone. But that is just like, that's like essentially what is the one of the biggest problems with like department stores today, right? This is what do you stand for? So I think people, designers, brand owners that have the guts to stand by what they are and to not deviate from that and be prepared to, to kind of put their stake in the ground. I think in the long run, okay, yes, you're not going to have maybe these like crazy surges, or maybe you will, but like actually that's also kind of scary. I think today, like the smart people are the ones that kind of can have a track towards this, and that really build their own community and to the level that they can, maybe their own platform for selling that product. Because if you sort of get that loyalty, even if it's on a smaller base, that's what's going to kind of carry you through, rather than being the one who just like kind of goes like this and then it's like Icarus and you fall down. Or the debate that's going on at the moment was that putting all your eggs in one basket, and how scary that can be for a brand where they think that they have a great business, but they have like one partner where the order is so huge that if something happens, like for example, which happened with a lot of designers with matches, when that went into administration, it was like someone just, it wasn't even that they pulled the rug, it was like they pulled the rug and underneath the rug there was like a big black hole. So I think there is, in that kind of eagerness of serving and, and maybe allowing people to grow too fast, or to try to be something, to your point with your brand, that where, you're trying to please people that are maybe not actually your people, that's just actually just gonna make the people that are your people not want to buy your product because they're then confused about what you are.
Mm.
I think I have a great example of this, and actually, I think I started and then we got sidetracked, which is very something that happens to me a lot because I then spin out to something else, as you probably realized from this conversation. But like John Vito Rossi, when he started, it was like at the height of that tribute, like mega platforms, and obviously he has a very beautiful, like timeless. Definitely, I mean, there's been a few platforms here and there throughout the years, but it's been done with like his way of working. But when he started, he was very adamant, I'm not gonna do platforms. And it was like the only thing that people, every shoe buyer was like, well, you have to do platforms. What did, otherwise, this is the only thing that's selling. Everyone wants to like the, triple platform, like 160, 180, millimeter heels. And he kind of stood firm and kind of just rode out that thing. And actually, it became even more clear about what he was, but it was because he was like, I can't, and this is like my brand. This is who I stand for. And just maybe that means I'm not gonna have all the accounts, but eventually, you know the right women will find my product and fall in love with it, and that happened. He is now one of the most established shoe brands out there, but he didn't want to dilute like what he saw himself to be. And I think, you know, I mean, this was like now probably like it's more than 15 years ago, um, like 18, 17 years ago or something like that. But I think that sort of attitude still stands even more to almost like that lesson or that way of working is even more important today.
When you're speaking with young designers, do you feel like you can tell when they need to just stay the course, like the example you're just using, versus when they need to change something? Because speaking as a designer, one of the most difficult things is knowing whether to stay strong on a certain idea, whether that's you know, that's your marketing or your retail strategy or even your aesthetic itself. But do you feel like you can tell what a young designer can do? And how can you encourage a young designer to stay the course if you believe that's what would be best?
When it comes to young designer, you there's a with great power comes great responsibility. That was like always, not to just be funny and quote Spider-Man, but I think there's ways to give feedback that is really important as well. Because I think what you don't want to do, particularly if someone's, early on or if they're like, newly established, is to actually get them to build confidence rather than lose confidence. So I think there's always like a level of like taking feedback, but also like how they receive feedback. Because I think again back to the whole thing of like where do you take on too much versus like the right amount. There's always a fine balance there that you have to, if you're the one giving feedback, really consider. So I think a bit like psychology, like you need to like read your opponent in the sense and understand how they work and what is going to work for them in terms of that, because otherwise you're not helping them. um I think you many times can do things. I think what is important is like trying to get someone to change the designs is not the right way. I mean, unless you're a designer yourself, right? And this is, I can't claim to be in any shape or form. Like, I like to think I can, spot a trend or know good design when I see it. But, redesigning and sort of, changing someone's completely, sense of their aesthetic is, I think then you at least for me, I would feel like I would be overstepping, because then I'm, essentially stepping into that person's shoes, and you shouldn't. Because if that designer doesn't have that, then what are you there to do? You can help lead someone along the way and encourage them, or help them with things like, because I think this is one of the things that I see a lot where brands, particularly in the beginning, but even after like maybe like 5 or even 10 years, it's like core product versus new season. What is the right balance? When is something a good carryover? But also like when do you kill that? Like when is it time to me? And maybe that's what you, in a way, were asking me. Like when do you kill your old friend? Because this doesn't really serve the purpose of what you want to say anymore, but it still gives you money to a certain extent. This is always like, it's something that there's not one answer on that. Unfortunately, I wish it was, and we spend so much time analyzing this at Net-a-Porter, like the curves of like, how many season is a core item still what we want to sort of give the customer. I mean, obviously, this is like an example from like the big great designer world, but like the Balenciaga City bag is like, it's the gift that keeps on giving, right? Or the Chloe Susanna boot that we talked about earlier. But I think like I think sometimes designers are too quick to kill something because they're bored with it. I think this is particularly true for very, very creative minded designers that have like just like a whole world each season. And that's where there is sometimes, the conversation that needs to happen about like, how do you tie the two seasons together so that for the customer, to your point that we talked about, like if something just changes completely, then, whether that is the creative designer or creative director of a big brand, or whether it's, someone really small who just like, next season I'm going to be, and then you like reveal yourself as something completely different. You go from like quiet luxury to go up core through to like boho, for example, in 3 seasons. Then you're like on a very slippery slope to confusion from your customer. So I think it's like finding that balance of like, you can definitely transition as a brand into a different aesthetics, and many brands do in their, like maturity curve, so to say, or just even like being around, that they also change, and they get older, they learn things like that, the way that they look at the world, the way that they dress changes, but there's ways to kind of do that with like a connection with your customer as well, which is like a little bit more gradual rather than like I woke up one morning and now I'm just going to tear away everything that I had. Um, for me, it was always like back to that whole thing of there is no one size fits all. Like it's really individual, and I think that's like the key thing when you give feedback to brands, that you don't just give them like, here are the five things, and there's always going to be the five things or three things or one thing, because everyone has a maybe a different like point that could be, no one is perfect. That's the reality. Not me, not you, not any brand in the world. So there's always something that someone can sort of point at or poke at.
Yeah, totally. And as a designer, you recognize that in the showroom because there's also buyers coming from all around the world, so something that feels light for me being in Los Angeles, like is probably too heavy for Singapore, or whatever it is. So there is a bit on my side that you have to take it with a grain of salt because if you completely listen to the buyers, you're going to have a hodgepodge of different ideas all kind of bricolage together, so it takes discernment on the designer's end too, right?
Definitely. I mean, like, you couldn't have described it better because, depending on where you come from, or even just knowing you can come from the same city, but your customer base is very different. You're going to be asking for very different things. And I think that goes back to the whole thing. What is being asked, does it actually make sense for your brand? Or are they just asking you to essentially change for them?
Yeah.
That's like an important question to ask yourself. Is this something that's going to benefit you and it will like, help you develop your brand? You know, for example, okay, like if you don't do knitwear, then, maybe if you're good at doing knitwear, I mean, like I've had brands where they're like, they get feedback, oh, this is like a denim brand, for example, and they're just, oh, but we can't just be denim, we need to do other things. But actually, because they didn't really truly believe in knitwear, that almost like made the collection worse because you came in and the knitwear were just like not special enough. So I think sometimes, particularly like as brands are establishing themselves, it's also important to not be like to go after everything. It's okay to do one category, if you're really good at it, and if that has a point of view and there's like something really interesting about it, you don't necessarily have to go out and make every single silhouette. I mean, even like if you look at the row when they started, it was very much like category by category, because they wanted to do, like, they wanted to perfect each new style, each new silhouette that they put in. And I think there was like an interesting lesson in that slowness as well, because I think today we're just very excitable, but it's also that pressure, whether that is the pressure to create the perfect collection from day one, even when you started yesterday, um, or whether that is to like run before you can walk, as a new brand, and you're just like, oh my god, they're saying like I have to have outerwear, I have to have you know I have to have like accessories, I have to create a bag, I have to have shoes. It's like, that's another thing, right? There's like a lot of people who are incredibly good at one category, let's say like ready to wear, but they cannot nail shoes or bags for life nor money. And that's okay.
I think some of that comes from just bad advice from buyers.
Yeah, it is so true. It is true. I mean, I think, like yeah, I think that goes back to with great power comes great responsibility. That sometimes, you, I mean, even if you're delivering that you do it with the caveat that this is what our customer is looking for, so that at least that the brand can, and I have said many times, I was like, when something is not what wasn't right for the retail that I was working, it was like, I genuinely like, I think this is great because X, Y, and Z, but this is not what we what we are looking for, or maybe what we ever will be looking for. But that, like, I would hate, like, you need to stay this course, and then actually come like, here's a list of people where potentially they would be interested in this. Roger, because I think sometimes there is also and this is something I'm going to sort of start to do mentoring, like with brands that, like, I guess, like designers that haven't even become designers yet. Like, it was always like really important to, or even if it's like a first that just starting out, to actually like do your research as well on like who you're approaching in terms of retailers, because I think to be targeted in your like aesthetic and your like wish list is also smart, because you're not going to be right for most brands. I mean, of course there are brands, but a lot of brands, especially today when there is million brands, are not always going to be right for everyone. So to do that homework of like, you know who would you sit next to, and like where would you actually be in this store, like where do you actually see yourself sitting? Because I think sometimes, at least in conversation I've had with this, like that consideration has not been had. They're just like, I want to be in this store because this store has a big name, but not actually considered the why.
Yeah, that's massively important. When you would go to see a designer, a young designer, somebody you were looking at bringing in, was there ever something about the person themselves that made you want to believe in them?
Definitely. I mean, I think, especially I think today, because that personality is is how you communicate with the world, right? And how your the sort of trickle effect of your community, your universe. Um, and I think, you could also, like, if you had someone who was like almost there, but then, the personality, you could like, this person is, they're so committed and they have this like energy that you really just want to help them. I think if someone, if the range was like almost there, one of the things that I learned as a quite sort of quite early on, but it's quite a heavy lesson to take, because you can see something and you'll really believe in it, but it's not just quite ready because like the pricing is not there, or the like production quality, or whatever it is, it's not fully there. Like what I realized, and what I sort of very much put into practice in my sort of like sort of, I guess, like halfway through my career, or like after like a little bit more than halfway, but like maybe after I'd been a buyer for a few years, after you've done that thing of like where you introduce something too early, not because it was a trend, but because they weren't ready. And the reality is, like, I mean, today it's worse than ever, but back in the day it used to be like a 3 season rule, that you gave like a brand 3 seasons, because the first season, obviously, you buy it, you have no analysis, no kind of feedback from the customer or anything. The second season, you kind of buying it half blind, unless they have a really good delivery. So you still haven't really got that much read. And then the third season, you actually have like full seasons read of what works and what doesn't work. And that's what I think, to me, it's really sad that that rule, I mean, I say rule, it's not a rule, but that that's not being observed to the same level, because very much like the creative directors that we talked about, and that kind of evolving circus, I think, is a similar thing with new brands, and finding their feet, right? Because if you really believe them to start with it, then there's clearly something there which is kind of combined, either like personality, as well as design. But what I learned on it is that actually, if I really felt that actually I would then instead, either myself, or later on, like through like the buyers that I had working underneath me, that we would work with that brand to get them where they needed to be. So whether that was like helping them find like production facilities that were going to do a better job than what they had, or helping them like work on the pricing, what should the like how can you get to that pricing, or whatever it be, so that actually when we introduce the brand, they would have you know like success that then is like so much more satisfying. And actually, I think one of the brands that we did that always was Charlotte, like Knowles, or like Charlotte Knowles as it was called at that point. Like we met Charlotte and Alex, and they were pretty fresh out and like so talented. And I mean, they're designers that I they still love, and I own a lot of it. But the pricing structure was like all over the place to start with because they were finding their feet. I mean, it's so hard. I mean, you will notice, like, the minimums, the quantities, finding the right factories, all of that. So Costanza, who's was one of the buyers that work under me, and she's like an incredible, like, I mean, she is a typical example of someone who has that, like, the gut and instinct, and also like the heart to help people. Like, she worked super closely with them, and when we then like launched them, which was like a few seasons later, it was like, it did so incredibly well. And it was such a nice feeling, like all those like stories where actually sometimes, like, when you held off, it it is frustrating for the designer maybe sometimes, because they're like, oh wait, but if you love it, like, why can't I go in immediately? But like doing that work with them, I think, to me, is actually more important. And that's also, like, when in the kind of period as you're building something, to have an open dialogue all season. Because I think today a lot of brands, get picked up and then no one says anything. There's no communication in season, and then, they come in the next season, they're like, oh, that didn't work. And it's like, wait, no. Like, as a young new designer, like, that feedback is so important, like the real time. I mean, obviously there's ways to be proactive about that as well, from the designer side or the brand side, to reach out and get that feedback. But I think there is a responsibility to be as transparent as possible. I think, transparency is not just a keyword in sustainability; it's also something that is really important to actually, make things better and to have open dialogues.
How important do you think it is that the retail staff, and maybe what burden does the retail staff have now that's changed? Because where I'm coming from, I worked retail and I did it for 8 or 9 years. I don't remember exactly, but I was so passionate about sharing the other brands with people because I always thought I want to be one of these brands. So I would hope that somebody treats my work like how I'm treating theirs. And so I felt like it was my moral obligation or something to really speak as well as I could about certain designers or brands. But do you feel like there's a distance now from the relationship the retail staff has with brands?
Hope not. I mean, I think, like, if you're a good retailer, or whether it's like, obviously, because that responsibility come from the buying office, like, you still, like, it's so important. And I mean, like, yourself, like, there's so many budding designers or just lovers of fashion that work on a shop floor. So I, like, for me, like, bringing in the designers to do staff trainings, or bringing in someone that can inspire them, and get like the storytelling there is everything. And I think, like, if you have the, I mean, we would always also like get feedback, and also be very, you know clear back to the brand as well. If someone's delivering like really trying, they're just like reading from a manual, then the staff would be quite vocal about like how boring it was, and it's like, I'm not going to come in early to sit and listen to someone just read up a manual. I can just read up, in the lunch break. But when someone was engaged, and many times there was like, like when the young designers are coming in, or someone who's like, really passionate about the brand, that storytelling is like, I mean, you will notice from working on the shop floor. I definitely noticed from myself, from also working on the shop floor. Like, the storytelling, that's what sells things. Those little anecdotes, or like the little details that maybe you don't find by just looking at the items, is key. I mean, I think there can be a fatigue, but it also can sometimes be, and I think this is so important, like a disconnect between like head office and the shop floor staff, where there's like a frustration from the shop floor because they don't feel heard or listened to. And I think that breaking that barrier, because to me, I've learned so much throughout the years. And it was something that actually, like when I went from something that was at the time purely brick and mortar, so like Harvey Nichols, to Net-a-Porter, like at first I was so blown away with how much data you could get from, and I mean, at that time, like the analysis and the tools that we had to draw data was incredible. But I quickly realized like the one thing that we didn't have and couldn't get was the things that we were missing. Like that, like when the customers has that conversation, like to their favorite staff member, or like just in passing, when they talk about like they come in and ask for a brand, or they come in and like there's like sizes missing, like that you're never gonna find that unless you have that connection. I think that for me was why I was also excited to go to brands where we had like both online and offline, so like physical and digital. And to me, it was like a really nice kind of combination of the best of two worlds, because I'd really missed that, like having those conversations. And some, brands for sure, someone that some really exciting new brands that we picked up because of conversations that either was like brands that custom had mentioned, but also the fact that like, you know, our staff there were so engaged with fashion. They knew so much. And I love nothing more, and I still like, they like still some of the people that are still in the retail space there, whether they moved on, are still some of my favorite people ever. And there's nothing better than having a conversation, because many times they're like telling me about things I don't know. So I think to have that and spend time, I think that's what's maybe missing today sometimes as well, particularly in this period of, customers being fatigued. Like the shop floor people that, in a way, to your point, has maybe become, their struggle is that they feel less heard than ever. They like the front line, It's like the
Exactly.
cavalry.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I think it's so important that you find retail staff that is really excited and wants to learn about the brands, as opposed to just becoming a cashier.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's also, and that sometimes, it's easier in a specialist boutique environment than in a big, like, department store environment. This is true. I mean, and that's also like where you can sometimes see the difference, on a department store where there's like the kind of shop-in shops and boutiques are run by, essentially, and paid for by the brand. And you start talking to that staff and they've been trained by, they got the full immersive experience, versus like the person who's standing next to them who, you know maybe just works 2 days a week because they just need to, like, get some extra cash whilst they are, completing their degree. So yeah, there's definitely a care that maybe doesn't always, or maybe it's not always possible in, like recruiting as well. But I do know, like, when you have like shop floor staff that are, I mean, and Lee Whittle, who was the retail and personal shopping director at Browns for most of my time. The work that he did with, like, finding those people was incredible, or motivating people that were there that he sort of inherited in a way, and actually kind of sometimes re-engaging people to get them to be excited again, when maybe, like, sometimes they lost a little bit of that passion. I think this is an incredible quality, but that also goes back to inspiring leadership, right?
Right. Why did you decide to leave Browns?
I think, like, I had done 24 years of, I'm going to say, like, corporate working. And Browns will forever be, I mean, it's like one of the most amazing things that I did in my career, and that I'm so incredibly proud of. But, the company had also changed a lot through, the trials and tribulations of Farfetch. And I think for where I stood, I'm not saying that what they were putting in place were wrong per se, but, their the strategies that they wanted me to put in place were perhaps not the strategies that I believed in. And I think I need to believe in something if I'm going to stand in front of my team and deliver it, and also live and breathe it. So, I found myself in a space where I was like, what do I do next? I've done this. This was incredible. And I had some offers to kind of continue that maybe corporate career. But at the same time, my business partner who I'd known for a long time came to me and looking for a partner to expand her agencies. And she's actually kind of opposite of me. She's been building an agency for 20, nearly 20 years. And for me, I was like, actually, this is exciting for me because I was so lucky that like what we had at Brown was, this moment in time that I think for me, and it was so hard to replicate because it was like a puzzle of personalities where everyone was so engaged and we all sort of were very different, but we all spoke the same language still. Um, and I don't know if I could even like want to replicate that. So I think for me, it was like the opportunity to do something that would draw from everything that I learned, but that would be different and deliver something different. And I think the other part of it as well was that it would allow me, which it has, which I'm excited about, to spend like more time also doing like pro bono, so to help like mentor young designers, because I do think like when you have been around for a long time, you have a responsibility to give back. And that was, something that I really believed in and did as much as I could. But when you're also traveling 180 days a year and, you're trying to run a team of, at one point it was like about 50 people, you don't always have, the ability to do all those things. And I still don't have it. I mean, I think, like if I was richer, I would be very happily devoting my entire time to that. But sadly for me, I still need to to make some cash. But it is something that gives me immense pleasure, and there's nothing nicer to sit down as well to talk to people and because for me it's inspiring, in equal measures. And if anything that I ramble on about can help someone not make the mistakes that I've seen people do, or me introducing a brand or a designer to someone who can help them in their career, then I feel like, I can go to bed happy.
Yeah. What have you, because it's been about, I guess, 9 months, right, since you left Browns. Now that you've been away from it, I mean, you spent 20 plus years just in the daily grind, and now you've had about 9 months of giving yourself some space. Have you had some new realizations just about your work since then?
I think, I mean, at first it's like a joking thing. I was like, I should have done this earlier. But the reality is, the reality is like I couldn't do it earlier because I needed to learn all the things that I learned, if that makes sense. Um, but I think it's been, I mean, obviously, like I did my sort of, you know, New Year, New Me kind of retreat that we talked about. But it, for me, it's like how inspirational it can be to be your own boss. Um, in a way, I mean, I'm very lucky that I feel like a little bit like I cheated because my business partner and the people that we have on the team are, they've been doing this for a while. So I almost had like a cheat sheet. Um, but I think for me to try to be in this position where I can decide my sort of daily schedule to a much greater degree than before has been really nice. I think also very good for my health, to be honest. I mean, my life work balance, if you ask my husband, is still not, definitely not where, maybe it should be, but it's a million times better. I think, and this is one of the sad realities, like buying today has become almost like a trading career in the sense of like just how much is piled onto people. And like, just like the kind of hecticness of the buying season and the traveling. And, obviously I did it longer than a normal trading career, but I also did see in my time, like how many people that, like did 10 years. And I think that's scary because what you lose is people with experience as well, just because of the craziness of the schedule. So, and then I say it as like I mean, you're in LA, so I will use this reference, but to me, it was like, if you work for one retailer, you're like, you have to stay in your lane, right? It could be the best lane, but you still have to, because if you start to like expand and, you're going to crash. Um, but like the way that like and what I've been like privileged enough to do with this company now is like I do get to do like most of the things that I really enjoy. So like creation, helping people build brands, like helping, you know, range planning and, you know, doing, as I said, like this also like be able to work more with young designers and but like and also I still travel a lot, but like I get to spend more time in LA, which is one of my favorite places in the world. So like this is also a bonus to me. But with all of that is like is the fact that I can actually be in all the lanes because when we work with you know the clients, like as I mentioned before, there's not like one size fits all. So the fact that like each client has very different you know areas that they want us to work with them on. And that to me is super exciting because it just sort of kind of engages me and engages, you know, the many parts of my brains, but like each in an individual way. Of course, there's overlap and people, you know, I talked about the community things and that people ask me for sort of slightly similar things, but the way that you approach this is still different.
Yeah.
And I guess that, you know, in that sort of sense, I'm probably still in the honeymoon phase. But you know, the honeymoon phase is great.
Yeah. That's great. It seems like you're in a really good spot and you're enjoying this like next layer of the work that you're going to do.
Yeah, you know, I am, and I think, you know, it, I like to feel my brain grow. And, you know, you know, buying was that for so many years, but in the end, you know, it does. You starts to be a lot of recognizable patterns. So I think for me as well, like I'm happiest when I can learn. Like, I would have been quite happy again if I was richer to just be like a student for like the rest of my life because I really enjoyed like you know going to university and going to college here in England. But you know if I can't do that, I think you know if I learn something every day, and today I learned so much, like just going to that breakfast this morning, and that I find so inspirational that I'm able to do things like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you ever think about your legacy or what would you want your legacy to be?
I touched on it before. Like I honestly like if I can help someone else like overcome some hurdles when they're like building their brands, that just will make me so happy. If that's my legacy that I helped other people, that's you know the most I can hope for, to be honest.